This documentary is inspired by several scholars, such as Steve Mason, the great Josephus scholar, Ralph Ellis, an independent scholar with outstanding, unique ideas on the historical Jesus and the New Testament background of Judea in Jesus' day. And finally, for the most intriguing hypothesis on the historical Jesus from Lena Einhorn. This documentary will rely on Lena Einhorn's hypothesis for the most part and her intriguing research that will inevitably become a part of the historical Jesus consciousness in scholarship, both Jesus-wise and biblically. Much thanks goes to Derek Lambert of Myth Vision for his having these scholars as guests on his show and for his inspiration and encouragement. And now, for the documentary, Jesus was historically real, but not the church Jesus. Jesus in the New Testament is arguably one of the most famous people to ever exist in history. And yet, ironically, there are precious few, if any, outside sources, historical sources, or treatises, or even letters written about his deeds from anyone outside the New Testament. Other than the Testimonium Flavianum, a small paragraph in Josephus, which many, if not most scholars, agree is in part an interpolation, there's not a lot about this Jesus fellow outside of the Bible. This has led scholars to presume that Jesus was, after all, not all that important to the outside world. Yet this is the gospel portrayal of his many miracles and of his gathering and influencing numerous thousands, if not tens of thousands of people in his day. A minority view says Jesus was a myth and that he never existed at all. But the hypothesis of Lena Einhorn is most unique because she has discovered an amazing series of parallels between the New Testament Jesus and Josephus. The scholars Steve Mason and Ralph Ellis have also elaborated upon this and added their own contextual parallels and themes and ideas. For now, we will focus on Lena Einhorn's idea and hypothesis. We can even now hypothesize why this rather startling omission of Jesus has occurred in history. There is an entire cohort of parallels, but there is an unusual catch. The amazing, and I think not coincidental parallels, are with a 15 to 20 year gap. Let's take a deep dive into this rather startling situation of a potentially very historical New Testament Jesus. Events depicted as happening in the 30s in the New Testament documents are not depicted at that time in Josephus, but he does depict those events in the late 40s and 50s. The consistent 15 to 20 year delay here seems highly unlikely to be Josephus making a consistent, steady chronological error on his part. He was too good of a historian to make that kind of error. These parallels provide new clues to the historical Jesus. The times of events happening in the New Testament is entirely known and based on known public figures in the text, not least in connection with Jesus' trial and crucifixion. Josephus tells us when Pilate was Roman prefect over Judea, and when Caiaphas was Jewish high priest, and in the 15th year of the reign of the Emperor Tiberius given when John the Baptist started preaching. The crucifixion of Jesus must have happened in the late 20s to mid-30s. The problem is this: a number of New Testament accounts do not fit within that time frame. This is why the new hypothesis of a time shift in history arose. We look at a number of chronological enigmas which have been noted by some scholars in the past, but escaped their understanding that these are dramatically significant clues to finding who Jesus is in actual history. The first enigma we will look at is the death of a man named Theudas. In Acts 5:35 through 36, it tells us how Jesus' disciples, at some point after the crucifixion of Jesus, are brought up to the Jewish council in Jerusalem. We assume Gamaliel said in verse 35, "in the 30s," because it follows after the crucifixion, but this is also before Saul arrives in Damascus. This happened when Aretas was king of the Nabateans. He died in 40 of the Common Era at the very latest. So the events of the Jewish council must have happened, according to the New Testament, no later than the 30s. But it couldn't have happened then. Josephus says of Theudas in the Antiquities 20, verse 97 through 99, "Now it came to pass that Theudas was procurator of Judea, that a certain magician, whose name was Theudas, persuaded a great part of the people to take their effects with them and follow him to the river Jordan. For he told them he was a prophet, and that he would by his own command divide the river, and afford them an easy passage over it. And many were deluded by his words. However, Theudas did not permit them to make any advantage of his wild attempt, but sent a troop of horsemen out against them, who, falling upon them unexpectedly, slew many of them, and took many of them alive. They also took Theudas alive, and cut off his head, and carried it to Jerusalem." But we know when Theudas was procurator of Judea, it was 44 to 46 of the Common Era. But Acts says he had been dead for some time in the 30s. Acts also misplaces the Jewish rebel Judas the Galilean, who says he was active after Theudas, but he was active 30 years before Theudas. Many scholars have noted this discrepancy and say it's a mistake in Acts. James Dunn, in his book Jesus Remembered, page 344, says so. Robert Eisenman, in his New Testament Code, is closer to our thesis, but he notes many parallels from Theudas to James, the brother of Jesus, utilizing Josephus's materials. A telltale clue is also the theme of robbers. This comes from the Greek word lestai. It's prevalent in the Gospels, to be sure. Jesus was crucified with 2 robbers. Also, Barabbas, and he evaded crucifixion, was a robber. Robbers are in Josephus also, but here we have a weird anomaly. Robbers are not just thieves as such, simply stealing someone's property. In Josephus, he has a very specific meaning and class of the robbers. These are they who are the Jewish rebels against Rome, and they are also against the Jewish establishment in Jerusalem. Many robbers gather in the Galilee. So, do the Gospels show the robbers as rebels? John 18, verse 40 says Barabbas was a robber. When we turn to the Gospel of Mark at 15, verse 7, Barabbas is actually described as being in prison with the rebels for having committed murder during the insurrection. What insurrection? When Josephus himself mentions robbers and robberies, they are actually in two distinct, different periods of time. It's from the beginning of the Roman occupation, that is, 65 BC, to the Jewish tax revolt in 6 of the Common Era. From that point on, up until 44 of the Common Era, there is no robbers. That is, during the entire gospel record of the length of Jesus' life, in Josephus, there are no robbers. Tacitus, in his history, 5, 9, and 10, said that under Tiberius, and Tiberius reigned from 14 to 37, the entire lifetime of Jesus of Nazareth, Tacitus says all was quiet. In fact, he said, on Herod's death, one Simon, without waiting for the approbation of the emperor, usurped the title of king. He was punished by Quintilius Varus, then the governor of Syria, and the nation, with its liberties were curtailed. It was divided into 3 provinces under the sons of Herod. Under Tiberius, all was quiet. Suetonius, in his book, The 12 Caesars, describes how Tiberius kept all quiet. He abolished foreign cults at Rome, particularly the Egyptian and the Jewish, forcing all those who had embraced these superstitions to burn their religious vestments and other accessories. Tiberius safeguarded the country against banditry and local revolts by decreasing the distance between the military posts. He also discountenanced city riots, and if any such broke out, he crushed them without mercy. He also abolished the right of sanctuary in temples and holy places which criminals enjoyed throughout the empire, and punished the people of Cyzicus for their outrageous treatment of certain Roman citizens by withdrawing the right to self-governance. So Tiberius knew what he was doing to keep the peace, and this lasted throughout Jesus' lifetime. So this is an anomaly. It wasn't until after 44 of the Common Era when robbers are again begin to be mentioned by Josephus, and he begins mentioning them very frequently. What happened in this era? The reason for robbers beginning to become abundant again, Herod Agrippa I had died, and therefore it was a return to direct Roman rule. Reza Aslan, in his book Zealot, describes when Paul arrived in Jerusalem in 57, he could not have come at a more chaotic time. 1 year earlier, the Sicarii had begun their reign of terror by slaying the high priest Jonathan. They were now wanton, murdering members of the priestly aristocracy, burning down their homes, kidnapping their families, and sowing fear in the hearts of the Jews. The messianic fervor in Jerusalem was at a boil. One by one, claimants to the mantle of the Messiah had arisen to liberate the Jews from the yoke of Roman occupation. Theudas, the wonder worker, had already been cut down by Rome for his messianic aspirations. The rebellious sons of Judas the Galilean, Jacob and Simon, had been crucified. The bandit chief Eleazar, son of Dineas, who had been ravaging the countryside, slaughtering Samaritans in the name of the God of Israel, he had also been captured and beheaded by the Roman prefect Felix. And then the Egyptian had suddenly appeared on the Mount of Olives, vowing to bring the walls of Jerusalem tumbling down at his command. So we see now when and where the tumultuous times occurred, and they were not during Jesus' day. So it's difficult to explain how Jesus could be crucified with robbers, rebels who had committed murder during the insurrection. Some of Jesus' disciples, such as Simon the Zealot, Judas Iscariot, Sicarios, Simon Bar-Jonah, seem better placed in a different era. Another issue we have with this chronology is the idea that Jesus was crucified in the 30s. The robbers surrounding him, also crucified with him, is interesting. What does Josephus say about crucifixions during this time? He mentioned many of them, but none between 4 of the Common Era and 46, except in the disputed Testimonium Flavianum, which does talk about the crucifixion and Jesus being the Christ, a disputed passage. It is especially after 46 of the Common Era, when crucifixions occurred under Tiberius Alexander, who reigned from 46 to 48, under Cumanus from 48 to 52, under Felix from 52 to 59, and Florus from 64 to 66, and during the Jewish War, 66 to 73. The word crucifixion in Josephus is much more rare than the word robbers is in his writings. There are decisive events that lead up to the war with Rome in Josephus's materials. The first item is the Galilean-Samaritan War, which occurred from 48 to 52. Josephus in this period mentions Samaritans 30 times, almost always related to the conflict. The other times he mentions them sparsely, it is unrelated to the conflict. The conflict had a distinct beginning and end from 48 to 52. The Gospels, too, mention the Samaritan-Galilean hostilities, but earlier, under Pontius Pilate. Later in the Acts of the Apostles, Samaritans are mentioned without there being a conflict. This could be coincidental. However, there is an important element in Josephus that deserves looking into. It's him describing the event that caused the war. Now there arose a quarrel between the Samaritans and the Jews on the occasion following. It was the custom of the Galileans, when they came to the holy city at the festivals, to take their journeys through the country of the Samaritans. And at this time there lay in the road they took a village that was called Guinea, which was situated in the limits of Samaria and the great plain, where certain persons thereto belonging fought with the Galileans and killed a great many of them. They complained to Cumanus and accused the Jews of setting their villages on fire. Jewish robbers attacked a village of the Samaritans and set their village on fire. Luke 9:51 through 56 describes this also. And it came to pass, when the time has come that he should be received up, he steadfastly set his face to go to Jerusalem, and sent messengers before his face. And they went and entered into a village of the Samaritans to make ready for him. And they did not receive him, because his face was as though he would go to Jerusalem. And when his disciples James and John saw this, they said, Lord, wilt thou that we command fire to come down from heaven and consume them, even as Elijah did? But he turned and rebuked them, and said, You know not what manner of spirit ye are of. There are several distinct similarities with these two accounts. Both accounts have Galileans traveling through Samaria on their way to Jerusalem for the festivals. Both accounts say the Galileans are not welcomed by the Samaritans, and this leads to a conflict. Both accounts mention these events occurring in a particular Samaritan village. Both accounts mention fire as punishment on the part of the Galileans, yet these accounts are thought to have occurred about 20 years apart. But the pattern here is obvious now. There appears to be a chronological chasm, as Ralph Ellis calls it. And there are many more events that strengthen this hypothesis. Immediately prior to this event, Josephus mentions another rebellion triggering event. It concerns a man named Stephanus. Josephus writes about this event in both of his books, In the Antiquities and The War. He describes an attack on Stephen, who is a Roman servant, on a public road where he was robbed. In reaction to this, Cumanus, the Roman procurator, sends soldiers out to the neighboring villages, and this sparks a sedition among the Jews. This is the only Stephanus in all of Josephus's writing. Stephanus also appears in the New Testament at Acts 6:5 through 8:2. But this is set in a different era, the 30s. It's 15 to 20 years earlier than the 48 dating found in Josephus, but it gives us the exact same time shift pattern here. This Stephanus in Acts, well, he was dragged by Jews out into the street and stoned to death, while his coat was put at Saul's feet. St. Paul later. Saul attacks the church from here on until his own conversion. Both accounts have the attack by a mob. Both occur on a road outside of Jerusalem. In Josephus's account, it is a Roman servant, that is Stephanus. So that is different from the book of Acts. Now, from here at this point is when we encounter many more robbers and the very frequency of their incidents in Josephus's material. So this is the beginning point for all of the violence in Judea by the Jewish rebels. In Acts, it's the starting point for Saul's violence and persecution of the early Christians. Both accounts only mention one Stephanus. They seem like the same event, even though Josephus nowhere describes the Christian movement. And yet he wrote this account in the 90s, many decades after the crucifixion of Jesus. So the question that we have before us is, could the New Testament description of the early Christian movement, and in other sources, was that depicted as something else? Is this the same Stephanus? Well, we can't know that for sure, but the next parallel leaves no doubt. This is concerning the two high priests. When both Josephus and the New Testament mention the various dignitaries, the procurators, the kings, the high priests, we know they are the same ones in both accounts. Yet while the names match between Josephus and the New Testament, the circumstances almost never do. The two that we're thinking of is Annas and Caiaphas. They are described in the Gospels as being high priests, but they are high priests together. And both of them are present at the trial of Jesus. Well, Josephus has no record of these two men sharing the office. Antiquities 18 does mention both men, Annas ruled first, but then there were three other high priests: Ishmael ben Phabus from 15 to 16, Eleazar ben Annas 16 to 17, and Simon ben Camithus 17 to 18. And now he mentions Joseph Caiaphas from 18 to 36. So in Josephus, the two high priests are not ruling together. They are definitely separated. And from this point in Josephus's account, we never hear about Annas again. So to be sure, there is a mention of two high priests. Jonathan and Ananias, son of Nebadias, in 47 to 55 of the Common Era, they both do high priest duties in the same period, and they are specifically referred to as Jonathan and Ananias, the high priests, in War II 243. So again, we see this same phenomenon of a time gap. Instead of occurring in the 20s and 30s, the two high priests functioned in the late 40s to 50s. Now, to posit it as a mistake of Josephus in the chronology doesn't make sense for this reason, because it would entail a change in names. And this changing of the names of public figures in the gospel text in order to either detect or to hide historical sources, well, that's a simple thing to do, and it is a radical intervention. But there is a consistency, regardless of which names would be changed. The events are the same events. Procurator Felix, as Josephus pictures him in the record, bears stronger similarities to Pilate in the Gospels than Pilate himself. Yet this was in the late 40s and 50s, mainly under Felix, and not under Pilate in the 20s and 30s. Yet in Josephus in the 40s and 50s, we just happen to find robbers. We also find crucifixion. There is, in point of fact, a Samaritan-Galilean conflict, attacks on Stephanus, and two reigning high priests under Felix in the 40s and 50s. And there is more than this under this peculiar time shift of 20 to 30 years in the historical record. Luke 13:1 says there were some present who told him about the Galileans whose blood Pilate had mingled with their sacrifices. Well, that brings up a knotty issue. Pilate was not the ruler of Galilee or of Galileans. Herod Antipas was. But Felix, 20 years later, he was ruler of Galilee. Galilee in his day, in the late 40s and 50s, was seething with messianic activity, numerous crucifixions and robberies and terror occurring on a frequent basis. Josephus noted in War II 253, the number of robbers that were crucified could not even be numbered, there were so many. Luke 23:12 says Herod and Pilate became friends after having been enemies. Matthew 27:19 also says Pilate's wife had great influence on him. She could talk politics with him. But no feud and no wife is mentioned by Josephus in regard to Pilate. But this was indeed accurate with Felix 20 years later. Felix was married to the Jewish princess Drusilla against the will of King Agrippa II, according to Antiquities 20:137 to 144. So Felix had a prominent wife, and at least for some time was at odds with the king. Luke also says at Jesus' trial, Luke 23:6 through 7, When Pilate heard this, he asked whether the man, that is Jesus, was a Galilean. And when he learned that he was under Herod's jurisdiction, he sent him off to Herod. But at this time, Herod Antipas ruled Galilee by himself. The words under Herod's jurisdiction seems superfluous. But with Felix and Herod Agrippa II, the sentence makes perfect sense, since from the mid-50s the jurisdiction over the Galilee was divided between them. Jesus, being a Galilean, would not have automatically put him under Herod's responsibility. Events in the Gospels ascribed to Pilate and his time fit better with Felix in the late 40s to 60s. Another serious issue in the Gospels that has been mightily wrestled with is the time of Jesus' birth. Matthew has Jesus born in the time of King Herod. The angel says, "Flee to Egypt. Herod will seek to destroy the child." Herod's successor, Archelaus, tells us this is Herod the Great. He died in 4 BCE. So from Matthew, Jesus was born before 4 BCE. Luke's birth story says something different, however. Jesus, born during a tax census of Quirinius, was governor of Syria. This census was 6 CE, but this is a 10-year difference. There is another chronology issue in Matthew that's worth noting. The return of Jesus from Egypt. Matthew 2:19-23 says, when Herod dies, Jesus returns from Egypt as a child. Matthew 3:1, immediately following, adds, in those days came John the Baptist preaching in the wilderness of Judea. There's no time gap between these two events. Jesus' return and John's preaching is in the same era. But Luke 1:36 says they are the same age. John could not be preaching as a child at all. Luke also notes John's ministry began in the 16th year of the reign of Tiberius, more than 20 years after the birth of Jesus, Luke chapter 3, verse 1. So we have to ask now, was Jesus really a child when he returned from Egypt? Celsus, a non-Christian writer, said Jesus returned from Egypt as an adult. We don't have his writings, but the church father Origen, in responding to Celsus, quotes him. Jesus, having hired himself out as a servant in Egypt on account of his poverty, and having there acquired some miraculous powers, returned to his own country highly elated on account of those powers, and by means of these proclaimed himself a god. Celsus also said Jesus' biological father was a man named Panthera. The Jewish Talmud, 300 years later, said Ben Panthera brought magic spells out of Egypt. In the Gospels, Jesus appears when he is about 30 years old, and is first not recognized in his hometown, Nazareth. So where was he for 30 years? Can we reconcile all these inconsistencies? Let's look a little closer. If the Herod who died was Herod Agrippa I, the ruler of Judea and Galilee in the early 40s, and not in Herod the Great's time, then Jesus could have returned from Egypt, both when Herod died and when John the Baptist started preaching as an adult. This assumes the time shift also applies to John the Baptist. Then he indeed would have returned as an adult, just like Celsus and the Talmud say so. The chronological issues in Matthew could be explained as a rudimentary implementation of a time shift. The inconsistencies are not unexplainable. The same events claimed to be happening in the Gospels are chronologically and hence historically inconsistent. If the same events are told in Josephus, 20 years later are shown, the time shift is dramatically seen visually. But we are not yet done with all of this. If the 30s, according to Josephus, have no strong messianic leaders, the 50s are not bereft at all of them. And the singular, most important messianic leader in the 50s, in Josephus's account, was the man called the Egyptian. Josephus writes, Antiquities 20:169f, "These works that were done by the robbers filled the city with all sorts of impiety. And now these impostors and deceivers persuaded the multitude to follow them into the wilderness, and pretended that they would exhibit manifest wonders and signs that should be performed by the providence of God. And many that were prevailed on by them suffered the punishment of their folly, for Felix brought them back and then punished them. Moreover, there came out of Egypt about this time to Jerusalem one that said he was a prophet, and advised the multitude to the common people to go along with him to the Mount of Olives, as it was called, which lay over against the city, and at the distance of 5 furlongs. He said further that he would shew them from hence how at his command the walls of Jerusalem would fall down. And he promised them that he would procure them an entrance into the city through those walls when they were fallen down. Now when Felix was informed of these things, he ordered his soldiers to take their weapons, and came against them with a great number of horsemen and footmen from Jerusalem, and attacked the Egyptian and the people that were with him. He also slew 400 of them, and took 200 alive. But the Egyptian himself escaped out of the fight, but did not appear any more. And again the robbers stirred up the people to make war with the Romans, and said they ought not to obey them at all. And when any persons would not comply with them, they set fire to their villages and plundered them." If this Egyptian, one of the major messianic leaders, had been active in the 30s instead of in the 50s, historians would unquestionably have compared him to Jesus. The Egyptian is defeated on the Mount of Olives, where Jesus was arrested. Both have previously lingered in the wilderness. Both speak of tearing down the walls of Jerusalem. Both have lived in Egypt. Both are messianic leaders with a great following. Both are perceived as major threats by the authorities. Aside from chronology, one thing that clearly distinguishes Jesus and the Egyptian are the circumstances of their defeat. The Egyptian is defeated in a battle. Let's look carefully at Jesus' arrest. What we find here is intriguing. Mark 15:7 says Barabbas was in prison with the rebels who had committed murder during the insurrection, as if we should know which insurrection Mark is referring to. But no insurrection has been described in the Gospels. The only description we have is when Jesus and his disciples go to the Mount of Olives to await his arrest. This conflict seems religious, and it is the Jewish council that arrests him. John deviates on this. John 18:12 says, "Then the band and the captain and officers of the Jews took Jesus and bound him." But who are the band and the captain? The Greek of the Gospel of John gives us the full picture, and it's startling. Band is the Greek word spira. It's a Roman cohort of 1,000 soldiers. Captain is the chiliarchos, the commander of 1,000. If John is correct, then what occurred in the mount must have been some sort of a battle. Remember, Luke 22:36 instructed his disciples to sell his cloak, to buy a sword if he doesn't have one. Now, this bears distinct similarities to those events of the defeat of the Egyptian. The location is the same. Josephus does not mention that the Egyptian was crucified. This seems to distinguish the Egyptian from Jesus, but it would not distinguish him from the man named Barabbas. Matthew calls him Jesus Barabbas in 27:16 and 17. It means Jesus, the Son of the Father. The Egyptian then vanishes from sight. His name, however, does appear again, but not in Josephus this time, but in the New Testament, in Acts 21:38. Paul has visited the temple, and in the temple, the people recognize him, they seize him, they take him out to kill him, they raise a complete ruckus, and the Roman guards are called over, and they start breaking it up. When Paul asks the guard, he says, "Hey, may I speak with you for a brief moment?" The guard is quite shocked that Paul is speaking to him in Greek. Here's what the record says. Acts 21:38. Then you are not the Egyptian who recently stirred up a revolt and led the 4,000 Sicarii out into the wilderness? This was said to Paul, who had been mobbed when he visited the temple. For Jesus to have been the Egyptian, we have to recognize that all these numerous events have been shifted back in time from the 50s to the 30s. And this answers the paradoxical fact that a person, Jesus in the New Testament, arouses such attention in his time and is seen as such a threat by the authorities, but is virtually invisible in other contemporary sources. Yet moving these amazing numerous parallels forward 20 years, we find Josephus describing Jesus and his activities in the New Testament. This amazing connection of Jesus and the Egyptian may have also traveled through history. Amulo, Bishop of Lyons, approximately 847, says the following about the name which the Jews give to Jesus. In their own language, they call him Usum Hamizri, which is to say in Latin, Desipator Aegyptius, the Egyptian destroyer. Also, in the Sefer Toldot Yeshu, Huldrych version 1705, it says, Jesus' biological father is called the Egyptian because he did the work of the Egyptians. And yet another early source saying Jesus arrived from Egypt, Christian Arthur Arnobius of Sicca against the heathen, and this circulated about 300 AD. Here's what Arnobius says. My opponent will perhaps meet me with many other slanderous and childish charges which are commonly urged. Jesus was a magician. He effected all these things by secret arts from the shrines of the Egyptians. He stole the names of angels of might and the religious system of a remote country. Jesus' connection to Egypt was disseminated and discussed both among his adversaries and his followers in the following centuries of Christianity. The Messianic leader John the Baptist is also intriguing. He was the forerunner of Jesus in the New Testament and preached at the River Jordan and baptized Jesus there. Herod Antipas was so threatened by John that he ordered to have his head severed and delivered to him on a plate in Jerusalem. That he had this power is puzzling, since he was the ruler of Galilee and not of Judea, where John the Baptist was active. Looking at Josephus's messianic leader called the Egyptian, we ask, did he also have a forerunner? And if not a forerunner, he had an important immediate predecessor whom we've already spoken of. He was Theudas. Antiquities 20, 97-99. Now it came to pass, while Theudas was procurator of Judea, that a certain magician, whose name was Theudas, persuaded a great part of the people to take their effects with them and follow him to the river Jordan. For he told them he was a prophet, and that he would by his own command divide the river and afford them an easy passage over it, and many were deluded by his words. However, Theudas did not permit them to make any advantage of his wild attempt, but sent a troop of horsemen out against them, who, falling upon them unexpectedly, slew many of them and took many of them alive. They also took Theudas alive and cut off his head and carried it to Jerusalem. Just as the Egyptian displays specific characteristics to Jesus, so too does Theudas to John the Baptist, although they are both, once again, 20 years too late. But Theudas is also mentioned in the New Testament in Acts. Acts mentions 3 of the messianic rebels found also in Josephus: Judas the Galilean, 6 of the Common Era, Acts 5:37, Theudas 44-46, he's found at Acts 5:36, and the Egyptian, the 50s of the Common Era, he's found in Acts 21:38. Now, these are rarely noted because the names are just thrown into the narrative, and there's no context to them. This random dropping of names seems inexplicable when we take them singly, one by one. Together, however, they form a pattern that is now coming into view. Luke defined the time of Jesus' birth with the census of Quirinius. That was in the 6th CE era, Luke 2:2 and Acts 5:37. To Josephus, this exact census is significant for only one reason: it organizes the beginning of the Jewish rebel movement under Judas the Galilean. The rebels seem to be present in the New Testament, especially in Luke and Acts, but only as a subtext. It is as if the New Testament is written on 2 levels: the obvious public one of Jesus as a pacifist, calm leader, the underlying level hinting at him being a rebel and in charge. Reading between the lines, we can see this. The century before the fall of Jerusalem was an intense period of scriptural scrutiny. They had seen them written on an obvious level and a concealed level. Mark 8:18, Jesus admonishes to look at the deeper levels for the hidden story. The narrative describing the life of Jesus, master of parables, would use this technique of writing on 2 levels. The New Testament by itself doesn't provide the reader with enough information to share anything but the obvious enough information and form. Occasional oddities, such as the naming of rebel leaders, or Jesus instructing his disciples to buy swords, or talks of fire from heaven in a Samaritan village, well, those remain unexplained. Putting the accounts of Josephus next to the New Testament, certain similarities and underlying patterns appear to pop up frequently. Of all the historical events described in the Gospels, only one fits the description by Josephus chronologically and content-wise. This is the census under Quirinius. But moving the Gospel account 15 to 20 years forward in time reveals correlation everywhere. And this is connection with numerous people in multitudinous various situations, and it does give great context to the unexplained oddities in the New Testament account. They form a pattern with regard to the subject matter. This is not coincidence. This could be seriously significant. Neither was Jesus just a minor character, one among many, nor is he non-existent altogether, but he is incredibly significant and was well known to the historical authorities, prefects, and emperors alike. A prominent messianic leader in history, if the shift is connected 20 years forward. The lost Jesus may very well have been hidden in front of our very eyes with a clever sleight of hand. If this time shift happened, why did it happen? Lena Einhorn notes, Josephus was the major historian, and there could not have been any way to directly compete with him, so Jesus' story was softened and slid back 20 years into the 30s instead of the 50s to avoid competing accounts. Josephus was a defector to the Roman side, and he was biased against the messianic leaders of the Jews. You can see this clearly. He hates the rebels. He can't stand. He blames the destruction of his entire people, country, and temple on the rebels, the messianic leaders. Those he saves special vituperation for. So Luke would have preferred to avoid competing with Josephus. And he wants to elevate his view of the Messiah, but in an earlier time period. The time shift would accomplish this, but it greatly diminished Jesus as a historical person. The authors of the Gospels thus can remove themselves with this shift from the rebel violence of the 50s.